Hi, I'm Eli. This is a little video on why React is not HTML. So in an HTML file, HTML is markup language. It's some text that gets directly read in by the browser. You write HTML body, a couple of divs, and then those get interpreted. They get put in the DOM, in the document object model of a web page, and they get displayed. You'll see uh, some div with some uh, other div inside it with some text. And so basically, because divs don't display as anything, you'll just see some text on the screen. And that's perfectly normal. It gets read in. If you edit the HTML file, the stuff on the screen will change. And then in a React file, in a React HTML file, generally there's only one HTML file. And in that React HTML file, you'll find barely a couple of lines. You might see some head elements with some code to bring in some scripts or some links or fav icons or whatever. But the majority of it is that in this body, you'll have some div and it has some ID. And the reason it has an ID is, we'll get to that in a second, but that's the way React throws in all of your React code that you write. And so the browser, sometimes if you inspect the code of the HTML on your browser, you might just see HTML body div and then ending your body in HTML text. And it's like there's nothing in it. And the magic of React getting the HTML in there that you see on your inspect screen, but not if you view the HTML code. If you look on the at the DOM in the dev tools, you'll see if an app is created by React, you'll see regular HTML looking code in the DOM. And the way that gets in there from React is through something called the React bundle. And a bundle is usually bundled by some other piece of software. You'll get to learn about that later. We use Webpack sometimes. We use Vite sometimes. There's Gulp. There's lots of things can bundle your React JavaScript into like one file or a couple of files that get loaded as they need to be loaded. But they aren't HTML, right? They're just some big file, and you don't see it. You don't see it in the HTML code. And then you might say, okay, so first we need to know a little bit about what how JavaScript gets some HTML into that DOM. Because if you look at the HTML file, there's nothing in there. But if you look at the DOM, if you look at the inspect inside your DevTools, you'll see HTML in there. And so you have to remember that the document object model is a model, is created. So the web browser opens up an HTML file and creates the document object model from the HTML. It just happens that the HTML and the document object model are pretty parallel. But in React, it's not parallel, but we'll talk about that another time. So how does regular JavaScript, if you're just writing a JavaScript file, how does JavaScript create HTML, like in the DOM? So what it does is it says, hey, we want to create an element. So we get the document. We say, hey, document, let's create an element. And so we create an element, and we create a div element here. So a div element, you can create an element with a name that doesn't even exist in HTML, but it doesn't really care. It actually is using XML, not HTML, to create the the structure of the page, but when we create a div element, it knows that it's a div like other divs. And then we want to just insert some stuff into that div. So this div doesn't display on the screen when we create it. It's just in the model. We know that it's in the model, but it may not be displayed on the screen. So we can enter some text in it. We can even enter some HTML directly in it, where we might say, let's add another div in there, not created the same way, but just created by text. And we insert that into the inner HTML of this element that we just created. And then we get the element by ID that's in that file that we told React to create. But say it's not React, say it's just vanilla JavaScript that we're writing. And so we find that document, that ID of that div. It doesn't have to be a div, but we know that its app is a div. And so we create a variable called React app div, and then we say, hey, find that div and then add something inside of it. We call it append child, and we put in that new element we created. So then as soon as you append the child, it knows where to put that div. And suddenly you'll see on the screen, if you have this JavaScript file loading, that element, there'll be some text on the screen, and it'll be this some text. And if you go into DevTools, you'll see the div with the div inside it, with another div inside it, with some text in it. And that's magic, right? You just created a few lines of JavaScript and you put that in the HTML. Even though you're not writing HTML, you're writing just some JavaScript functions, some methods on the document. And so you might say, I've watched some React tutorials and I've never seen anything like this code with the new element, create element, and the get element by ID. You might say, I've never seen that. And that's right. We don't do this in React, except in rare circumstances, and it's usually frowned upon. You can do it in React, but because React uses something called a virtual DOM and not the regular DOM, you don't do it. But basically, it kind of does it for you. But instead of having to write all these lines of JavaScript, it uses some magic that we'll talk about to create something that looks like HTML. And the thing that looks like HTML is called JSX. And in React, you write function components sort of like this. You write some exported function. We'll call this new div, and it has some props. We'll talk about props at a later time. But then it returns something that looks like HTML. And you might say, well, it's just HTML that you're returning, right? And the answer is no. It is not HTML that you're returning. You're returning JSX. So it's not HTML, it's JSX. What is JSX? So when you call JSX with these angle brackets around it, it's a way to call a function. And you might say, that doesn't look anything like a function I've ever called in JavaScript. But what this JSX language does is it replaces those function calls with something that looks a lot like HTML. So instead of thinking about it like HTML, you're actually doing a function call that's like some function with some arguments. And so what's inside of this div are actually arguments. And also what's in this path right here where we say class name equals card, that's also an argument. So you might say, hey, these don't look anything like arguments. Okay, so why is div and angle brackets in JSX really like calling some function called div with some arguments? So each JSX element, when it gets read, it gets interpreted like a function. you don't see it like a function, but it gets called like a function. And there are these sum arguments, and really what you get in sum arguments are a couple of different values. If you destructure them, you might have seen destructuring before, where you have some curly brackets and then you have some variable names inside the curly brackets, and you're destructuring that from some other single argument that's really an object. So here the keys are children and some other arguments. It might be class name, it might be some other property that you're some other attribute that we call a prop on a JSX tag. So if we write div class name equals a class, and we put an A and then another div inside of it with a B inside of it. So right, we have a div inside of a div with some other text. Really what you're doing is you're calling this function div, and you're passing it a class name, an A, and a div inside of it. So really what this looks like is div with some curly brackets in it, because we're trying to show you what's in this sum arguments. There's class name, that's an argument, that's part of the arguments. There's children, that's also part of the arguments. And you'll see A is a string, and it's an array, A, and then you get past also div with a B in it. So this is another call to another function, right? Remember, so this would be a call to a function div with no class name, but children with an array that has one element that's just the string B. So this is the way that this gets interpreted by JSX. So you might say, that looks like HTML. It's kind of complicated if you think about it. But once you get used to it, you're like, it's basically just as easy as writing HTML. You just got to remember when certain things don't work. And you might say, why don't things work if I'm missing a closing div tag in JSX? You might say, in HTML, you forget a closing div tag, it throws off your formatting, but the page still loads and everything works fine. But when you're missing a closing tag in JSX, it's sort of like things break. Not always, but sometimes. And it's sort of like writing a function, or writing that you're calling a function, but forgetting the closing bracket, closing parenthesis on the function name. It'll break, right? It won't work. If you load JavaScript, it'll load, but it won't work. It'll crash somewhere. It's the same thing with React. It'll crash somewhere. So it may be one of your components is crashing, it just doesn't show up. Unlike if you forget a div tag, it'll show up, but then the formatting of whatever is after will be messed up. But here you got to remember to close your div tags. And the way that things are easier to reason with in React is you write things that are components. So this thing right here, this new div, is a component, a function component. And it's a function component because it returns some JSX. Whenever you return JSX, this new div can be called with angle brackets because it'll interpret it like JSX. And so the stuff keeps going down the function call. If you look up what calling a function does, it puts things on a stack. And so basically what React is putting a bunch of tags on a stack. And interpreting them as you go down, but you're creating these components. And so usually when the components are pretty small, so you'll know when you're opening and closing a div tag, even though remember, these are not div tags, but JSX elements. And JSX elements are really like functions. So it's kind of a complex thing that gets made easier and just gets made so you can type things in an easier manner. You don't have to worry about knowing which class name you're calling in, or what the properties called children are. You just write some stuff inside of some div tags, right? And so, but instead of like HTML, where it gets interpreted just as HTML, React takes that and runs the function. And it runs the function and it creates this thing called a virtual DOM, and then pushes that over to the regular DOM, so that when you edit, when you use React, when you use dev tools, not React dev tools, but regular dev tools, you'll see the HTML like you would in a regular HTML file, but really it's come in because you're executing, you're running these functions in JavaScript.